At 76, the man who once screamed louder than the world went silent. Ozzy Osbourne, the godfather of heavy metal, the madman who bit off a bat's head on stage, the rock legend whose music defined rebellion for an entire generation has taken his final bow. But his end wasn't theatrical. It wasn't loud. It was devastatingly quiet. On July 22nd, 2025, the Prince of Darkness died after years of battling Parkinson's disease, crippling injuries, and a storm of silent suffering that no crowd ever saw. To millions, he was immortal, untouchable, but behind the leather, eyeliner, and stage smoke, Ozzy was fading. He once said, "These past few years have been sheer misery." His legs stopped working, his voice trembled, his world shrank from screaming fans to hospital beds and home railings. But that wasn't the most painful part. What haunts us now isn't just that he's gone. It's everything we didn't know he carried. Because behind the music, behind the madness, was a little boy from Birmingham who never stopped screaming, not for fame, but for someone to hear his pain. So what happened to Ozzy Osbourne? How did a broken, bullied child become one of the loudest voices in rock history, only to die in a silence more deafening than any scream? Before he was Ozzy Osbourne, the wild man of rock and roll, he was simply John Michael, a skinny, quiet boy from the soot-covered streets of Aston, a working-class district in Birmingham, England. Born on December 3rd, 1948, he was the fourth of 6 children crammed into a tiny 2-bedroom council house. Life wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Cold nights, empty stomachs, and the constant noise of factories shaped every breath he took growing up. His father, Jack Osbourne, worked double shifts at the General Electric Company, coming home exhausted, short-tempered, and emotionally distant. His mother, Lillian, held together what she could, working in a factory while trying to manage 6 kids on a shoestring budget. There was no softness, no space to dream. In that house, survival was the only goal. Ozzy later recalled those years as a prison, one not made of bars, but of silence, shame, and fear. They had no hot water, no heating, and often not enough food. His school uniform was always tattered. His shoes had holes. But what hurt more than poverty was the feeling of being unwanted, an invisible boy fading into the gray wallpaper of British post-war misery. He wasn't good at school, not because he didn't try, but because the words and numbers seemed to mock him. Ozzy suffered from undiagnosed dyslexia, which in the 1950s wasn't even a recognized condition. Teachers called him slow, classmates called him stupid, and when the taunts weren't verbal, they turned violent: punches in the hallway, kicks in the yard, bloodied lips and bruised arms, and no teacher ever asked why. He had one teacher who told him flat out, "You'll never amount to anything." Ozzy believed it. For years, he carried that sentence like a prophecy carved into his bones. Home wasn't a refuge either. His father, a war veteran with strict values, didn't believe in coddling weakness. Once, when Ozzy came home crying after being beaten up at school, Jack didn't comfort him. He beat him again. "I was teaching him to be a man," he said later. But what he really taught Ozzy was that pain was normal and vulnerability was dangerous. Even among his siblings, Ozzy felt like the outsider. He wasn't as sharp as his older brother. He wasn't as charming as his sisters. He was the one who mumbled, who got lost in thought, who was afraid of everything and everyone. His only solace came from sound, radios, records. The voice of the Beatles became his religion. The day he heard "She Loves You," something cracked inside him. It was the first time he felt awed, and it didn't come from people. It came from music. At age 11, he earned the nickname Ozzy, and though it started as a joke, it stuck. It was the first identity that didn't make him feel like nothing, but the pain kept piling. At 14, unable to bear the bullying, the poverty, and the unbearable weight of feeling useless, Ozzy decided to end it all. In a tiny bedroom lit only by a weak bulb, he tied a rope using his mother's laundry line, climbed up on a chair, and waited. Fate intervened. His father walked in, saw him hanging, and pulled him down only to beat him again. Weakness gets punished, Jack told him. That was the moment something inside Ozzy froze. He stopped speaking unless spoken to, stopped caring, stopped hoping. He started skipping school, roaming the streets, stealing small things just to feel something. At 15, he dropped out completely. No diploma, no direction, just a growing void inside. He drifted through dead-end jobs, a car horn tuner at a factory, a slaughterhouse cleaner, a construction laborer. He was fired from everyone. I was always in the wrong place, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong job. Ozzy would say later, I didn't fit anywhere. By 17, he had nothing, no money, no future, no self-worth. One night, desperate and high, he attempted a burglary without a clue what he was doing. He was caught almost instantly. Sentenced to 6 weeks in Winston Green prison. The experience was terrifying. He didn't just feel alone, he felt erased. But that's where something began to shift. One afternoon in that prison, as he sat on a metal cot, a radio played, the Beatles again, She Loves You, the same song from his childhood. It wasn't just a melody, it was a message, a reminder that sound had the power to change things. That maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to disappear. Maybe he could scream loud enough for someone to finally hear him. He didn't know how to play a single instrument, couldn't read music. But in that moment, Ozzy knew what he wanted: to make noise, to scream louder than his pain, to be unforgettable. He had no map, but he had a mission. And in the ashes of poverty, humiliation, and near death, a legend began to form, not in triumph, but in defiance. When Ozzy walked out of prison at 17, he didn't return to a warm welcome or a second chance. He returned to the same cramped house, the same disappointed father, and a job market that didn't want him. He was lost, directionless, and more broken than ever. But something had shifted inside him. He'd tasted hopelessness. And now, somehow, he was hungry for noise. He still didn't know how to play a single chord, couldn't afford it, and could barely read. But he had one thing that no one could take from him: a voice, a scream, a sound that came not from training, but from torment. It didn't need polish. It needed pain. And Ozzy had more than enough of that. In 1960, and using money borrowed from his father, he bought a cheap PA system and posted an ad at a local record store: Ozzy Zig needs gig. That simple piece of paper started the chain reaction that would eventually lead to one of the most powerful bands in rock history. The first group he joined was called Rare Breed, alongside a local bassist named Geezer Butler. The band fizzled quickly, but something clicked between the two misfits, both outsiders, both obsessed with dark themes and strange energy. Soon they were joined by guitarist Tony Iommi, a factory worker who had lost the tips of 2 fingers in a machine accident, and drummer Bill Ward, who played with the fury of a man chasing a demon. 4 broken souls, stitched together by rhythm and rage. At first, they called themselves Earth. They played bluesy rock in dim pubs, barely scraping together enough to afford gas for their van. Crowds were small, pay was worse. But their sound, loud, heavy, brooding, began to evolve into something darker. It wasn't fun music. It was exorcism. It was noise that meant something. Then came the turning point. One day, they noticed people lining up around the block to watch a horror film called Black Sabbath. Ozzy, eyes gleaming with mischief, said, if people are paying to be scared, why don't we make music that scares them? The name stuck. The sound deepened. And just like that, Black Sabbath was born. They didn't look like rock gods. Ozzy had a gap in his teeth, long, greasy hair, and a twitchy awkwardness. Tony played guitar with plastic fingertips. Geezer wore black like a priest at a funeral. But when they played, something happened. The room shook. People stopped talking. They didn't just hear the music, they felt it. They started writing songs that no one else dared to write: about war, mental illness, death, and inner demons. And Ozzy's vocals raw, off-key, but unrelentingly honest became the centerpiece. He didn't sing like an angel. He howled like a man on fire. By 1969, they landed a record deal with Vertigo Records. And on February 13th, 1970, Friday the 13th, no less, they released their self-titled debut album. Critics hated it, called it primitive, satanic, unlistenable. But the youth, they devoured it. Finally, someone was speaking for them, the lost, the angry, the ignored. That same year, Paranoid was born, written in a rush, recorded in days. No one expected much from it. But then came War Pigs, Iron Man, and the eerie title track. Suddenly, Black Sabbath wasn't just a band, it was a movement. The album soared to #1 in the UK and broke into the American top 20. They were no longer local outcasts, they were global outlaws. Ozzy was stunned. "One day I was mopping floors," he'd later say. "The next I was flying to America with long hair and a suitcase full of bats." It wasn't just fame, it was escape. For the first time in his life, Ozzy was being seen, and not as a failure, but as a frontman, a leader, a star. But he never forgot the pain. On stage, he channeled it. Every shout, every scream, every twisted lyric was an echo of that little boy from Aston who no one believed in. His past didn't disappear, it just got louder. Through 1971 to 1978, Sabbath released a string of groundbreaking albums: Master of Reality, Volunteer for Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage, each darker, heavier, and more chaotic than the last. They were the fathers of heavy metal, though they never asked to be, they just wanted to be heard. Ozzy, with his unpredictable energy and tortured voice, became the face of the band. Fans worshipped him, labels feared him, and inside, he still didn't feel like he belonged. Fame didn't fix the emptiness, but it did give him a stage to scream it from. And as the applause got louder, so did the noise in his head. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy Osbourne had become more than a musician, he was an icon. Black Sabbath wasn't just a rock band anymore. It was a sonic hurricane, a global force, the godfathers of heavy metal. And at the center of it all stood Ozzy, arms stretched wide on stage, eyes rolled back, drenched in sweat, shrieking into the abyss like a man possessed. This wasn't music for the faint of heart. It was fire, brimstone, and thunder. And fans couldn't get enough. Albums flew off shelves. Stadiums sold out in minutes. From Los Angeles to Tokyo, from London to Sao Paulo, the name Ozzy Osbourne meant something primal. He was chaos, rebellion, danger, and somehow a kind of salvation. He didn't just perform, he devoured the stage, bathed in blood-red lights, draped in black leather and crucifixes. Ozzy looked like a preacher from hell, but behind the madness, there was something magnetic. His voice haunting and raw cut through the noise. It was unpolished, imperfect, but real. It wasn't trained, it was surviving. Black Sabbath's 1970s run was legendary. Albums like Master of Reality, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage didn't just sell, they changed the shape of music. Critics were slow to catch on, but fans didn't care. The records became sacred texts for the disillusioned, the outcast, the angry. Money poured in. Ozzy bought mansions, cursed jewelry. He wore silk capes on stage and threw buckets of water at fans. He was outrageous, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Every night was a spectacle. Every show was part concert, part exorcism, and the audience, they worshipped him. He was a contradiction. Off stage, he was painfully shy. On stage, he was unchained. In public, he stumbled through interviews, often slurring his words, eyes blinking like he couldn't keep up with the world. But once the music started, he became something else. A vessel, a scream wrapped in flesh. But with fame came pressure, and with pressure came addiction. Ozzy had already started drinking heavily in the early years of Sabbath, but now it wasn't just booze. It was pills, cocaine, tranquilizers, uppers to get him going, downers to bring him back down. He joked about it on stage. "I'm not an alcoholic." He'd slur, "I'm a rock star." But deep down, he was slipping. Band tensions grew. Tony Iommi, the band's guitarist and unofficial leader, grew tired of Ozzy's erratic behavior. Missed rehearsals, sloppy performances, fights that never got resolved. The brotherhood that once held the band together began to rot under the weight of success and excess. But to the outside world, everything still looked perfect. In 1978, they released Never Say Die, an album recorded in chaos but promoted like a triumph. They went on tour with Van Halen as their opener. Ozzy was still front and center, screaming his guts out. But the cracks were showing. Behind the eyeliner and theatrics, he was exhausted, disoriented, hollow. Backstage, he barely spoke to his bandmates. On stage, he ran on autopilot. Between gigs, he locked himself in hotel rooms, surrounded by empty bottles and people who didn't care whether he lived or died. But fans didn't see that. They saw the Ozzy who wore flowing robes, who screamed Iron Man like he was raising the dead, who stood like a tune on stage, unshaken and immortal. Even the infamous bat incident added to the myth. In 1982, during a solo concert, a fan threw a live bat on stage. Ozzy, thinking it was rubber, bit its head off. When it twitched in his mouth, he realized the truth and was rushed to the hospital for rabies shots. It was disgusting, insane, and unforgettable. That moment would follow him forever. To some, it was grotesque. To others, it was legendary. But to Ozzy, it was just another blur in a life spinning out of control. Still, he kept going. Because in his world, you didn't stop. You screamed louder. You drank more. You played until you collapsed. That was the deal. But somewhere inside, he knew. The fame, the fortune, the fans, it wasn't fixing him. The little boy from Birmingham was still there. Still scared, still aching, still screaming to be seen. And soon everything would come crashing down. Because no matter how loud the music, no matter how bright the spotlight, pain always finds its way through. By the end of the 1970s, Ozzy Osbourne had everything: money, fame, a place in rock history. But inside, he was already gone. The man who once screamed to drown out his demons was now drowning in them. In 1999, after years of substance abuse, missed shows, and rising tensions, Black Sabbath made the brutal decision. They fired Ozzy. Not face to face, not with a goodbye. They sent someone else to deliver the news. They didn't even have the balls to tell me the tools. Ozzy later said, "That was my band." The betrayal hit him like a bullet to the chest. Sabbath wasn't just a Bob, it was his salvation. The one place where chaos had meaning. Without it, he collapsed. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. He holed up in a dark hotel room in Los Angeles, curtains drawn, alcohol flowing, drugs within arm's reach. For days, maybe weeks. He didn't eat, didn't shower, didn't speak. I numbed myself until I couldn't feel anything. He said, "I thought I'd fade away in that silence." To the outside world, he was still Ozzy Osbourne. But behind that door, he was a ghost, a scream without sound. Just when it seemed like the void would swallow him whole, a woman walked through the wreckage. Sharon Arden, daughter of Sabbath's former manager, refused to let him disappear. She saw through the filth, the booze, the bitterness. "You were the magic in that band." She told him, "You don't need them. You can do this on your own." With her help, Ozzy clawed his way back into the light. But it wasn't clean. It wasn't easy. Together with a young guitar prodigy named Randy Rhoads, Ozzy formed a new band and began recording what would become Blizzard of Oz. Released in 1980, it was a masterpiece, an album born from desperation, but burning with raw brilliance. Songs like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley weren't just hits. They were resurrections. For the first time in years, Ozzy had purpose, a reason to breathe again. Randy wasn't just a guitarist, he was a lifeline. Gentle, focused, and fiercely talented. He balanced Ozzy's chaos with calm. Their bond was deep, spiritual. Randy gave Ozzy discipline. Ozzy gave Randy fire. But lightning never stays. On March 19th, 1982, while on tour in Florida, tragedy struck. During a stop at a private property, their tour bus driver, a licensed pilot, decided to take a small plane for a joyride. Randy Rhoads and the band's makeup artist joined him. Ozzy stood below, watching, smiling faintly. The plane made 2 low passes, but on the third it clipped the tour bus, spun out of control, and exploded into flames. Randy was 25. Ozzy ran toward the wreckage, screaming Randy's name until his voice broke. He collapsed beside the smoldering debris, shaking, weeping, begging for it to be a dream. For days, he was inconsolable. For weeks, he couldn't speak. I lost a part of myself that day. He later said, "It wasn't just Randy's body in that fire. It was my hope, my music, my reason to keep breathing." The man who had been pulled from the edge by friendship, Hubert, was now thrown back into the abyss by fate. He spiraled again. The drugs returned. The drinking worsened. Concerts were canceled. Laughter vanished. "I didn't want to live," he confessed. "I didn't want to play music. I didn't want anything." But even that wasn't the bottom. In August 1989, years into his marriage with Sharon, Ozzy reached his most terrifying moment. One night, drunk and high beyond comprehension, he snapped. The details are still unclear even to him, but in a blackout haze, he lunged at Sharon, threatening to kill her. She locked herself in a room and called the police. Ozzy woke up in a jail cell with no memory of what had happened. When told, he broke. "That wasn't me," he said. "It felt like I was watching someone else do it." He was charged with attempted murder, but Sharon didn't press charges. Instead, she gave him an ultimatum: get help or we're done. He was committed to a psychiatric facility. There were no lights, no microphones, no fans, just Ozzy shaking, ashamed and hollow. He didn't speak for days, didn't eat. He sat in silence, drowning in guilt. A counselor once asked him, "What do you fear most?" Ozzy replied, without hesitation, "That she'll leave me, that I finally pushed her too far." But she didn't. Sharon stood by him, tired, hurt, but unbroken. "You're still in there," she told him. "I know it." In that cold, sterile place, Ozzy began to fight not for his career, not for redemption, but for love, for himself, for the man he didn't recognize anymore. It wasn't healing. It was war. And for the first time, Ozzy wasn't screaming on stage. He was screaming inside, begging for one more chance. Ozzy Osbourne didn't walk out of that psychiatric facility healed. He walked out haunted, quieter, thinner, still broken but aware now of just how close he'd come to losing everything. And that awareness, it became his weapon. By 1990, Ozzy wasn't trying to be the Prince of Darkness anymore. He was trying to be a man, a husband, a father, a survivor. He reunited with his trusted guitarist Zakk Wylde and poured every ounce of regret, pain, and clarity into a new project. The result was No More Tears, released in 1991, a raw, defiant album that wasn't about chaos. It was about control, about owning the wreckage he'd created and choosing to live anyway. "Mama, I'm Coming Home" wasn't just a song, it was a confession, a prayer, a promise to Sharon, to his kids, and to himself. And fans listened. The album was a massive hit, selling millions, pulling Ozzy back to the top not as a wild myth, but as a man with scars. But recovery wasn't a straight line. Behind the scenes, he still fought demons. Every day sober was a war. Every stage appearance was a miracle. Sharon became more than his wife, she was his manager. his nurse, his enforcer. She threw away his pills. She dragged him to rehearsals. She stood between him and the cliff, again and again. "I owe her my life," Ozzy would later say. Not once, but every single day. In the early 1990s, Ozzy worked like a man afraid of what would happen if he ever stopped. Tour after tour, album after album, his music evolved. The screaming softened. The pain became poetry. He wasn't just loud anymore. He was honest. He gave interviews where he cried, admitted to abuse, talked about suicide, and in doing so, he connected with fans who were no longer rebellious teens, but adults now fighting their own darkness. In '92, he announced a farewell tour. But true to Ozzy fashion, he didn't stay gone. He came back again and again. Because while the drugs had nearly killed him, the music had always saved him. Then, in 2002, something unexpected happened. The world met a different Ozzy. Through the Osbournes, a chaotic, unscripted MTV reality show, fans were invited inside the Osbourne home, and what they found wasn't terrifying. It was hilarious. Ozzy, now in his 50s, stumbled around the house in slippers, mumbling about TV remotes, arguing with the family dogs, and trying to understand his teenage kids. He wasn't the bat-biting maniac anymore. He was a confused, lovable dad, and America fell in love with him all over again. The show was a massive hit, pulling in millions of viewers per episode. Ozzy became a cultural icon again. But this time not for the music, for being human, for being real. But behind the comedy, there was still pain. In December 2003, Ozzy nearly died again. While riding a quad bike on his estate, he lost control, crashed, and was thrown violently to the ground. He shattered his collarbone, broke 8 ribs, crushed a vertebra in his neck, and punctured a lung. He was placed on a ventilator, unconscious for 8 days. Doctors didn't expect him to walk again. But Ozzy did what Ozzy always did. He refused to die. Through agonizing rehab, months of recovery, and relentless therapy, he clawed his way back step by step. And in 2004, just months after the crash, he walked onto the stage at the Brit Awards to a standing ovation. Not as a rock god, but as a miracle. The pain never left. But Ozzy didn't run from it anymore. He learned to live with it. Some days, he could barely move, but he moved anyway. "I wake up and it hurts," he said, "but I'm still breathing. That's enough." Then came the final blow. In 2019, Ozzy fell again, this time in his home. The fall dislodged metal rods that had been placed in his spine years earlier. The pain was excruciating, but it was the diagnosis that followed that broke him. Parkinson's disease. A silent thief. One that would take his balance, his movement, his independence. At first, Ozzy kept it private. He didn't want pity, but when the tremors got worse, when the cane became permanent, he went public. "I can't walk properly anymore," he said, "but I'm not done." In 2020, he released Ordinary Man, a haunting, vulnerable album that felt like a goodbye letter. But it wasn't. It was a love letter to life, to fans, to the fight. Ozzy no longer needed to prove anything. He had survived overdoses, mental collapse, the loss of his closest friend, near-death crashes, and now Parkinson's. And through it all, he kept singing, not for charts, not for fame, but for meaning. His voice was weaker, his steps slower, but the message was louder than ever: "I'm still here." In the final stretch of his life, Ozzy Osbourne no longer chased fame. He didn't need to. His legacy had already been written in riffs, in screams, in scars. By 2025, his body had weakened beyond return. Parkinson's disease had taken its toll. The once electric performer now moved with a cane. His voice, often little more than a whisper, but he still lived with purpose. He spent his final months surrounded by family at their home in Buckinghamshire. Sharon by his side, Jack, Kelly, Amy, Jessica, and Lewis nearby. Gone were the arenas, the stadium lights, the madness. What remained was something deeper. A garden, a pair of headphones, old records spinning stories from long ago. On July 5th, 2025, just weeks before his death, Ozzy returned to Birmingham one last time. He stood on stage with the original members of Black Sabbath, leaning on Sharon's arm, his hands trembling. He looked out at 40,000 fans and said goodbye. This may well be the last time I ever stand on a stage. It was. On July 22nd, 25, the world lost the voice that had once howled through hell. But Ozzy didn't vanish. He echoed, in murals on city walls, in songs that still shake speakers, in fans who got through dark nights with his music in their ears. He left behind more than platinum records. He left behind a message. You can come from nothing. You can break 1,000 times, and still you can rise. Ozzy Osbourne was never just the Prince of Darkness. He was proof that even the most shattered souls can still scream and be heard.